Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being so patient. Welcome to the Long Island Energy Panel. My name is Kathy Wisniewski. I am a Community Customer Manager at National Grid. What I do at National Grid is I'm basically an energy advisor and work with the largest customers across Long Island, working on their gas growth projects, gas efficiency projects, economic development, you name it, I'm working on it. So what I'd like to do is actually go through and introduce the panel and then just talk about the allotment of time for the speakers. So let me start off by introducing Tom Falcone. Tom is the Chief Executive Officer of the Long Island Power Authority. It's the third largest public-owned electric utility in the United States. And Mr. Falcone joined LIPA in January of 2014, first serving as Chief Financial Officer. Prior to joining LIPA, Mr. Falcone was an investment banker and advisor to publicly owned utilities and state and local governments. In that role, Mr. Falcone worked with many of the largest public utilities in the United States and raised more than $25 billion for infrastructure investments across the country. Mr. Falcone is a board member of the Large Public Power Council and the Advanced Energy Research and Technology Center at Stony Brook University. Mr. Falcone received a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Next we have Frank Wallach. Frank is Vice President of Fuel Cell Energy. Frank's position encompasses all aspects of commercial efforts through North and South America, including sales, business development, project development, and marketing. And of course, last but certainly not least, we have Richard Kessel. Richard is a power industry executive who is formerly chairman of the Long Island Power Authority and president and chief executive officer of the New York Power Authority, the largest state-owned public utility company in the United States. Currently, Richard is president of East Coast Progressive Energy Solutions. So what we'd like to do is, unfortunately, we had another panelist who couldn't make it today, so we should have plenty of time. But really, Tom will lead off with the lead presentation, and then we'll follow up with you gentlemen and have time for questions and answers. So, Tom?
Give us a minute to bring it up. You seem to be having IT issues.
I'm trying to get the projector. I'm not seeing anything on the screen.
Can you sing, Tom?
I can sing, I can do jokes. I can even do it without a presentation. So.
I gotta pull this up real quick, but I'm seeing nothing there. Yeah, because I got the. Let me just open that real quick so it's ready. Now it's going to be ready. Now I need it. Some kind of store. Wait till the differences are we was the last building.
I just get started. So we thought we'd talk about two things this morning, or I'd talk about two things this morning. The first would be a little bit about where LIPA is, as LIPA is part of Long Island's energy future, and the second is some general industry trends. So in terms of what LIPA is up to, I think it all starts with what do customers want, because part of this is to provide customer value and satisfaction for the customer dollar. A lot of, all 3 million people on Long Island are sending their money to LIPA every month, and are we providing value for what they're looking for out of their electric utility? And so it's something we spend a lot of time thinking about, and one of our trustees, Trustee Cordero, happens to be in the room. We've spent the last few years thinking about what can we do to make sure that we're doing the right things for Long Island. And what customers want, when you look at the data, and there's lots of data and different surveys, and you can focus in on this thing, but it's a whole mix of things. So It isn't as simple as one might think. Because one might think, well, what do customers want? They probably just want a low price. But it turns out they want a whole mix of things. They would like you to be doing the right things for their community, stewards of the community. That includes a sustainable infrastructure, corporate citizenship, power quality and reliability, customer service, reasonable rates, helpful billing and payment processes. So that sets up because, frankly, if you it's like Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, you might end up someplace else. So this is what customers indicate they want, and what has our board said that we're going to do about it? And because that's step number 2. Once again, if you don't know where you're headed. And so the board has set a few targets for us. And in the area of corporate citizenship, they said we're going to comply with the state's clean energy standard, and that means adding 800 megawatts of renewables between now and 2030 on Long Island's electric grid. It means 950 megawatts of energy efficiency. So that's the equivalent of something like 680,000 typical Long Island homes. So changing the electric grid in a pretty substantial way between now and 2030, which may seem like a long way off, but frankly, blink of an eye. Corporate customer service and satisfaction, very key thing. So the board has said that we should be in the top 25% of utilities for customer service and satisfaction. There's plenty of ways to measure that, and I'll come back to it. Power quality and reliability, we should benchmark our reliability to other electric utilities and should be in the top 25%. But beyond that, we should also look at not just our average customer's reliability, but also the customer that has the worst service, and make sure that their service is not that far from the average. In helpful billing and payment processes, those are things like offering various customer rates and customer choices, things like EV rates, convenience of payment, paying by credit cards, all those types of things. And finally, you have to do all these things at reasonable rates. And so what is reasonable? You know, reasonable isn't going, we have the cost structure of a New York utility, so we're never going to have the cost structure of a Florida utility. Different parts of the country have different costs. And the nice thing about the electric utility business is you know what everybody's costs are because you can just look at their rates. They're all regulated. But what the board has said is our rates need to be reasonable for the New York metropolitan area. It needs to be in the pack for where customers, businesses, residences are going to live. And where's that going to be? It's going to be, you're going to live on Long Island, you're going to live in Westchester County, you're going to live in New York City, you're going to live in northern New Jersey, you're going to live in Connecticut. So you can look at those utilities and benchmark yourselves. But at the same time, you know, there's multiple ways to get to reasonable rates. You know, one tactic one can use is just debt today versus debt tomorrow. You know, if bonding is really simply rates today, rates tomorrow, we're going to have sustainable fiscal practices. We're not going to do slightly lower rates today by pushing off the bill to tomorrow. So they set some goals around those. So how are we doing? And I'll talk about these very briefly, but first, customer satisfaction. So this really is the gold standard. You're meeting it or you aren't. We are, with PSEG since 2013, the most improved utility in the country. And these are our neighbors here, but really in the whole entire country, as measured by J.D. Power. And so that's quite an accomplishment, but as anybody who's ever you know, seen a kid's sports team or something else, most improved usually goes to the kid that wasn't very good. And that's the case for us too. We didn't start in the right place. We actually started not just low, but actually dead last in the country. So we had a lot of room to catch up. The nice thing about this is we're most improved, but we're now in the pack. So here's some of our neighbors and how they're doing. And we're still at the bottom end, so we're not really where we need to be. But we're in the pack. You know, take 143 points off the score and you're way outside the lead. You know, now, frankly, you're mediocre. So we're mediocre now, and that's okay. In fact, I saw the president of Southern California Edison a couple of weeks ago in New York City, and he's long been someone who was a consultant to LIPA in the early days, worked with Ritchie, you know, when LIPA bought Loco, and I subsequently, as a banker, knew him when he became the CEO of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And so anyway, I saw him in New York City, and he said, well, Tom, how are things at LIPA? I hadn't seen him in quite a while. And I said, well, Ron, we're mediocre now. And he said, wow, that's quite an accomplishment. And I think it is. So, but mediocre on the way to being great. I mean, the board has not set the goal to be mediocre. The board has set the goal to get to great. And so that's something that we're working on. and that's a lot of, means a lot of different things. Reliability, that was another core thing that if you're going to do this business well, you need to have reliable electric service. So we have the largest investment program that we've ever had. We have a $2.8 billion 5-year investment program. That's hard physical infrastructure. That's substations, that's poles, that's wire. And the centerpiece of that is a $730 million grant we got from FEMA, which is one of the nice things about having a publicly owned electric utility, because we're eligible for FEMA grants, which, you know, a lot of, coming out of Hurricane Sandy, a lot of electric utilities adopted storm hardening programs. Ours is one of the larger ones. One of the nice things about it, you know, PSEG New Jersey has a storm hardening program. Con Edison has a storm hardening program. The Connecticut utilities have storm hardening programs. One of the nice things about it is our customers aren't paying for it. There are nice people in Alabama and Tennessee and Florida that are funding this grant that allow us to harden our infrastructure. So it's a benefit of having a public utility on Long Island. We're doing work all across Long Island. Matter of fact, we do focus groups, and you go into a focus group and you know, you're behind a mirror and they bring a whole bunch of people, and you can have a customer that really, really does not like LIPA or PSEG. They don't have a kind word to say for an hour-long focus group. And then at the end, the moderator will say, you know, is there anything these people do right? Is there even one thing they do right? And inevitably the answer is, boy, they're doing a lot of construction. Because we're doing a lot of construction. And it's all across the island. It's more than double the pace. You see it, all those new poles, all those new wires when you're going down the street. Some of those double poles, while we work to take them out. You know, all that construction, and it has very dramatic effects. So we started with the worst circuits, and we're hardening the worst circuits for storm resiliency. And what we're seeing is before and after, it's about an 80% improvement in reliability. And so that's a fairly dramatic program. It's elevating substations that flooded during Sandy or ones that are prone to flooding. It's also putting automation on the grid. So you can use basically smart breakers. And what it does is if, say, a tree comes down and hits a wire, and there's 3,000 people on that circuit, it's just like a circuit in your house. You know, you blow a fuse and the kitchen's out. Well, what if you could segment that line so rather than the whole kitchen's out, it's only one electrical socket? And that's basically what we're doing. So now the tree hits the line and maybe 500 people lose power. And then we can isolate it and we can restore it faster. So another thing that we're doing, just in 2018 we put out a budget, and in addition to the storm hardening program, we have this rather substantial budget. Like I said, it's a $2.8 billion 5-year program. $700 million of it is the storm hardening program. $2.1 billion is all this other stuff. So in 2018 alone, we'll replace 320 miles of distribution circuits with stronger wires and poles. We'll add 200 of these smart switches to the grid. We'll upgrade about 150 circuits affecting 500 neighborhoods, the ones that are the worst off, the ones that have service that isn't within an acceptable range. 60,000 feet of aging underground cable, 7 new substations, and 138 kilovolt transmission cable in western Nassau. That will actually improve service for 625,000 of our customers. That's about 60%. So look left and right, and about 60% of the people in this room are going to see service improvements. Some will be modest, some will be quite dramatic. Just next year, not a 5-year program. Another thing that we put out in the 2018 budget is to move to smart meters. You may not be aware, but you have a dumb meter right now. And so what does a smart meter do? Sounds smart, right? But what does a smart meter do? It basically just communicates with the utility. And so right now, a meter maid comes to your house and reads your meter every other month. And it's purely physical. And so instead, the meter will let us know, you know, what power is being used. Well, why do you care? Well, a lot of different reasons. Number one, we can offer you a lot more pricing plans. So we can offer you a lot more flexibility in how you choose to interact with us. Different pricing plans that better meet your household budget. Number two, if you lose electric service right now, you know, somebody calls it in. That's how we mostly know about it. Instead, now the meter will let us know. So the meter will tell us before you call us. Equally, sometimes you get an outage and you know, you call it in, your neighbor calls it in. Might be 2 causes to that outage. You might have had a tree fall on a branch up the circuit, and then maybe there's also another one. So we go and we fix the first one. We don't know you're still out. There's 2 causes to your outage. Now you can see. You can look for things like somebody bought an electric car on the street. You know, whoops, better go fix that transformer before it blows. So preventative maintenance, reliability, that's a 5-year program, so it's going to be about a quarter of the customers a year getting new meters over the next 5 years. And I'll just spend one more minute on things in 18, but things that are important to us. We mentioned economic development, we mentioned being part of the community. We're going to launch 2 new economic development programs, very consistent with the Vision Long Island message. Those 2 programs are focused on, number 1, vacant storefront. So if you're a small business and you have a vacant storefront, we're willing to give you about a year's worth of free electricity to move into that vacant storefront and get started. You know, because usually those small businesses are on the cash poor side. And then secondly, if you're doing a downtown area, a redevelopment area, and you're putting money into it, your town is putting money into it, well, give us a call. We'll see what we can do too. We're doing something on super savers. So that's basically, I mentioned all these smart meters and all this new technology coming out. We're going to basically take one area in North Belmore and throw everything we have in it, in the kitchen sink. It's an area that has low growth that we're going to have to put a lot of money into upgrading the substation in the area. But we're going to put everything we have at it, and we're going to see what customers want. And then whatever comes out of that that makes the most sense, we're going to roll out to everybody else. And finally, EVs I'll come back to, but if you have an electric vehicle and you're considering one of the restrictions is most people are going to charge at home. But what if you forget to charge? The anxiety that comes with that. If you had workplace charging, the occasional time you forget to charge, you can plug in at the office, but we started a new EV charging program for the coming year. So I mentioned doing all this great stuff, you got to do it within a budget. And so our electric rates are about in the middle of the pack for this area, and the goal is to get them down to the low end of the pack for this area. But one thing I do think is interesting to note is that electric bills are basically flat to what they were 10 years ago. So here's for an average residential customer, your electric bill next year will be about $159. It was $154 in 2008. So bills are basically flat, but we're investing a lot of money into the grid and improving customer service and satisfaction. Compare that perhaps to, say, the Big Mac. It's apparently 48% more expensive than it was in 2008. But not 48% larger or 48% better. And probably we should all be thankful it's not 48% larger because for the obvious reasons. Or, you know, who couldn't mention the iPhone? Because interestingly, this new iPhone costs people more than their electric bill. By the time you buy the phone and then you sign up for your data plan and all that stuff, you know, frankly, but you get a lot of value out of that iPhone, I presume. Although I'd like to see operate it without electricity. And then one final thing on what we're doing at LIPE, and then I'm going to transition basically to how I see the energy industry changing and how its impacts are. But debt, you know, we just have too much, and that comes from buying the Long Island Lighting Company 100% for debt. It was the right thing to do, and much credit to Richie Kessel because it immediately reduced electric rates on Long Island by about 20%. And things like that FEMA storm hardening program, had that not been done, we wouldn't be able to do that. So it has dramatically lowered electric rates on Long Island for the last 20 years. But, you know, that's not an unusual story. What's unusual about it, that you know, most of the publicly owned electric utilities actually were privately owned at one point. What's unusual about it is if you're in, say, Omaha, they bought the local investor-owned utility in, I think, 1938. And we did it about 18 years ago. So it's just like a house, right? I mean, you go and you buy a house, you're going to have a mortgage payment for 30 years, and then your costs go down once you pay off the mortgage. Well, we're still paying off the mortgage from purchasing LOCO. We've got a little bit to go, but the board has set a target basically to get in the zone of where other electric utilities are. And that reduces rates over time, and we get to that zone in 2026. That's not that far away. We've had some bond rating upgrades. We had one upgrade by Moody's. Moody's, since 1998, hasn't had one nice thing to say about us. They upgraded our rating last year. S&P just last week came out and put us on a positive outlook for an upgrade next year. In the 18 years, they haven't one time done that before. And then interestingly, just yesterday, we have to do annual capital borrowing. So we went to the bond market and we sold $350 million of bonds to fund our 2017 capital investments. And we had $6 billion of orders for $350 million of bonds. So I felt like Steve Jobs, you know, they were selling like hotcakes. We couldn't keep them in. But you know, I was a banker. That doesn't happen. So it gives you some sense that people think that we're making the right moves financially as well, and that our plans are sustainable. So now I'll flip over to something else, which is just utility industry trends and how they affect Long Island. So that was what we're doing at LIPA, but there's also something just going out in the electric utility business. You know, you go on every morning, you flip the light, it goes on, you pay your bill, you know, you get the bill, you pay it. It may not seem like an industry that's changing that much, but actually in a number of ways it's changing very rapidly. And so two I'll talk about are declining electric sales and energy efficiency, and then the second one is the rapidly declining cost of clean energy, because I think that will be very important as we go further out. So declining electric sales, we're in a interesting time. So it's a little hard to see, but basically what this little chart shows is electric growth year over year around the country, national trend, from the 1960s to today, and then projected out to 2040. This comes from the Energy Information Agency, the US government. So historically in the 60s, growth was 6 to 8% a year. And then by it's hard to see, but by the 1980s, it was about 2 to 3% a year. So every year, people use 2 to 3% more electric than they used the prior year. The last 10 years, it's basically been flat. I mean, there is no electric growth. And then going out the next 20 years, basically the government projects that the rate of growth of electric sales will be half the rate of growth of the economy. So historically, economic growth and electric sales were very tied together, and now they aren't. And a couple of obvious reasons for that. One is energy efficiency, efficient appliances. So today's refrigerators use about 1/3 the electricity of a 1970s model. Today's heat pumps about the same. And then you also have people putting on things like rooftop solar and distributed generation. So if someone is putting rooftop solar on their house, they're still using the electric grid every day. They're buying and selling. There's no point in the day when their production equals their use. So they're using the electric grid, they're buying and selling. But over the course of a year, they're buying less from a central station power plant than they were before. They're producing. So at every given moment, the infrastructure is still being used, but over the course of an average year, obviously, you have less sales out of central station, large central station power plants. And so that's interesting. And the one thing I would mention there, too, is that there's this quote, too, which is, electric consumption remains flat as Americans build larger homes, construct new commercial building, build new information technology, run more heat and air conditioning. And the reason I like the quote is it's from Dr. Corey which is the director of the Energy and Environment in the Energy Institute of Alabama. And so I figure that if it made it to Alabama, it's made it everywhere. So you can see it really is a national trend. So anyway, we see that on Long Island too. And look at what's happened to, this is a chart that shows our need for power plants, basically. And so you don't really need to know anything about the chart other than to see the trend. This was in 2010, and we projected out how many power plants we would need. And you see the growth from about 5,500 to about 8,000 megawatts on Long Island. And every year, the growth has come down. So for 2030, we now need 1,700 fewer megawatts than we did now. That's about 4 power plants, 4 Port Jeffersons, that we don't need to build. So we see the trend locally. We're not going to be building major power plants to meet load growth. And that's been a big change, and that isn't over a long period of time, that's over the last 7 years. So that's one big trend, national trend coming to Long Island. Another thing is number of states, in the absence of a federal energy policy, number of states are innovating, and we see that in New York. So New York has assigned a goal of 50% renewable energy by 2030. They've said we're going to build 2.4 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. That's enough to power about 1.2 million homes. There's NYSERDA doing planning for that. So these are pretty significant goals. And then they come down, LIPA is one of 7 electric utilities in New York. So there's 7 of us. And those state goals get basically, trickle down to each of the utilities. So, when you take the state goal, this is how it translates to what Long Island needs to do. We need to add 800 megawatts of clean energy, 950 megawatts of solar, And frankly, we need to figure out how you integrate all this offshore wind because you may have noticed we jut out into the ocean, so we're a little closer to it than most. And so in the short term, what do we do in 2017? We added New York's first offshore wind farm, 90 megawatts. And that will be operational in 2022, but we selected that project out the East End. We signed up 2 new utility-scale solar projects, so we now have the 3 largest utility-scale solar projects in New York, all on Long Island. We did a proposal to use, commercial rooftops or under the Home Depots, the big box retailers. People haven't been using them for solar for a whole variety of reasons, so we went out and we did a separate bid targeting just that segment and got 31 projects, about 20 megawatts. And then finally we selected 3 fuel cell projects, which we'll also talk about. And that's the largest commitment of fuel cells anywhere in the state. So I looked down and I said, boy, we've had a very productive 2017. We're only one electric utility in the state. I don't know what all those other 6 are up to, but they should try and catch up. And so that's fine. Those are state-oriented goals, right? The state has said you're going to do this. But what's actually, I think, more interesting is how the prices of this technology are changing and declining so rapidly, because it's one thing to have a state-oriented goal. It's a whole other thing when the cost of clean energy is basically parallel with the cost of what your existing other sources of supply are. And there's some places in the country you already see that, say in California. But here's just a couple of projections. Here's Bloomberg New Energy Outlook. They say onshore wind will reach parity with new build gas plants by 2023. Offshore wind will decline 70% by 2040. Solar by 66% by 2040. Battery storage 70% by 2030. That's one. Here's another projection from the U.S. Energy Information Agency for 2022. You don't need to know the chart other than to say the cost is declining a lot. That's what they're projecting. And what's interesting about it is they're really just projecting out recent trends. So here's actual bids for offshore wind, for example, in Europe, where the industry is much more developed. So something going into service in 2017, actual strike price, 20 cents a kilowatt hour. 2022, 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So the interesting thing is, as you move from 20 cents to 7 cents, what would Long Island's electric grid look like if you had 7-cent offshore wind off Long Island? And that is a very real possibility. Not a guarantee, but a very real possibility. So if you're going to sit there and you're going to build a power plant, or you're going to make a big investment decision for Long Island today, you would certainly want to take into account that things are changing a lot. And you would want to make sure that you don't overbuild yesterday's technology when the technology is changing so rapidly. And so that is basically what our plan is. We put out a plan for Long Island to get us through the next 20 years, but reality is we'll update that plan every few years because the industry is changing very rapidly. But the thing that we noticed is that we're in a period of very great technological change. Energy efficiency, very great technological change. Rooftop solar, declining cost of batteries, declining cost of renewables. And the nice thing that we have on Long Island is that these are our generation under contract. This is what we have. And once again, you don't need to pay too much attention to the details other than the distance. So take 2023 here. We need 5,300 megawatts of generation. We have 6,300. We've got 1,000 megawatts more than we need. This 5,300 already has insurance in it. So it already contemplates what happens if a unit fails, what happens if a tie line goes out. So we've got about 1,000 megawatts of excess generation. What's really nice about that, though, is the dark blue is what's under contract to us. And look at, by 2028, there's basically nothing left. The light blue is the stuff that has come off contract. So basically, we're well positioned for this very rapid change in technology because all of our contracts are coming off. We can remake the grid to whatever we need it to be. And that kind of, we didn't recently build a big coal plant. We didn't recently commit to a specific technology that would keep us glued to that technology for 30 or 40 years. So that puts us in a very good place. What we do see, though, is under almost, we ran a whole bunch of scenarios. Here are our 3 big steam plants on Long Island, and those steam plants, those are the big ones that you're familiar with. Northport, Port Jeff, Barrett, and they look like this. And so here's the runtime. So here's the runtime of Barrett. It was running 54% of the time in 1999. It's running 44% of the time, 44% of capacity now. And we don't know what the future holds. We run a whole bunch of scenarios, so here's some sensitivities. But for 2030, with the changing electric grid, with the increase in efficiency, with the increase in self-generation, with the new renewables coming onto the system, we project that that plant will run somewhere between 6 and 10% of the time. You know, Port Jefferson's already declined a lot. Northport, the same. So all the range, what it tells you is that the technology is changing, and essentially these plants are being replaced by different generation of different sort and a different location. It's still very necessary. We need the plants. We don't run plants because we don't need them. We still need them, but the technology is changing, and we'll change with it. One of the things we're studying, though, is what would the future grid look like? Because as that technology changes, you see the runtime of, say, Barrett go down to 10%. You wouldn't build the same unit again. I mean, you just wouldn't build the same unit again. Power plants are like cars. So there are power plants that are like the minivan, and then there are power plants that are like the 18-wheeler, and they serve different purposes. There are big plants and little plants. So this would be an example of a little plant. Looks like a jet engine. This would be an example of a big one. Here's a battery, and then we're going to talk about fuel cells. They'll have different footprints and different operating characteristics. But the key thing to know is that the mix of the types of power plants is changing, and so we will have to change with it. And we'll have more renewable generation, but we probably also need smaller, more flexible plants with greater what we would call ramping characteristics, the ability to ramp up generation and ramp it down more flexibly, quicker and faster. So for example, the steam unit takes about 26 hours to start, and it can't run for less than 16 hours. What if we were to replace some of that with a peaking unit that can start on 10 minutes notice and could run for a minute, and you can turn it off, just like an aircraft, right? I mean, when you go to take an airplane, the pilot doesn't start the engine the day before. But what if you have more intermittent renewable generation on the system? And over the course of a year, you know how much that solar farm or the wind farm is going to produce, but in any given minute, you don't know. Well, what you would want is very flexible generation so that you could support and back up that renewables. So if we have a grid with more renewables, we're going to have to contemplate more aircraft engines and fewer larger what we call combined cycle plants, for the same reason that cars come in different shapes and sizes. You got the minivan, you got the 18-wheeler. If you're going to buy a gallon of milk, you wouldn't take your 18-wheeler down. Equally, if you're going to move construction equipment, you wouldn't do it with your minivan. So that leads to, I have two final slides. And so one is that these big plants are around, right, and you all see them, and there is an important thing there for the communities that host the plants, because they've gotten very used to very substantial property tax payments, and this is something that's been in the news. And the plants, unfortunately, have gotten a little bit out of whack in terms of what they're worth versus what the taxes are. So, taxes on power plants are just like taxes on your house. You're supposed to take the value of whatever the plant is and multiply by the tax rate, and that's what you pay. So here we have like the Caithness plant. We pay about $9.7 million a year. It's a new plant, 350 megawatts. Runs most of the time, 90% of the time. Compare that to, say, the Port Jefferson plant. Same size plant, we pay $33 million a year. This one runs 10% of the time. So power plants are like cars. They're worth less with time. This one is in very good shape, but it doesn't run very much, and it's certainly not worth what this one's worth, but the taxes are 3 times as much. And even if we went to replace it, the tax bill would be this. We're paying 3 times what we pay on a brand new plant. And you have Northport. It's about 4 times the size of Caithness, but 8 times the taxes. Glenwood, interestingly, we had a steam plant there. We took it down in 2012. All that's left is a little peaking unit, like a jet engine. We pay taxes on it as if the steam plant's still there. It's basically a vacant lot, but the tax bill didn't really reflect it. And then you have Barrett, which is about twice the size of Caithness, but 4 times the taxes. Compare that to, say, this plant up in Bowline, this Bowline plant in Rockland County, very similar to us. The property taxes are $3 million a year, So it's twice the size of Barrett, runs about the same, 43 million or 3 million. You know, LIPA doesn't pay any taxes, our customers pay taxes. And interestingly, our tax burden embedded in our electric bill is 15% of your bill, which is about 3 times the national average. It's higher than anywhere else. And so there's been litigation that's been going on for a long time, and the first tax case is coming up in March of next year, and it's just like if you were to challenge the assessment on your house. I mean, if the tax assessor said your house was worth 20 times what it's actually worth, if you had a house that was worth $100,000 and they valued it at $2 million, that would be the equivalent of this, then you would go to court and you challenge your assessment. But I'll leave you with one final thing, which is we've talked a lot about what we're trying to do at LIPA, which is improve customer service and satisfaction and invest in the right things, including clean energy. We've talked a lot about how the technology is changing in the energy sector. More clean energy, efficiency, cost is down. The interesting thing is that while we are focused on power plant emissions are only 18% of New York State's emissions. So the other 82% comes from other things, primarily transportation, and then the second big category would be residential, and this is mostly home heating and principally oil use. And if you care about carbon, for example, you could focus all on the 18%, but frankly, you got to look at the low-hanging fruit in some of these other categories, and the answer to reducing carbon emissions in those other categories, like transportation and home heating, is electrification. So one of the big trends that if you care about carbon is to find ways to electrify transportation and to electrify home heating. And the good news, take for example an electric vehicle, just today's electric vehicle with today's power grid, it's the equivalent of a car that runs 125 miles a gallon. So if you take all the emissions from the plants that charge the battery and everything else, it's still 125 miles a gallon. You can't buy a car that will go 125 miles a gallon. And so that shows you what the opportunity to reduce carbon is in transportation. It comes from batteries, because basically all transportation is, all an electric vehicle is a battery, a big battery on 4 wheels. And the interesting thing, what we were talking about is changing technology. Batteries are declining in price a lot. The forecast was it was going to decline 60, 70%. That's been the recent trend, and you see the auto manufacturers for the first time really putting a lot of money in batteries. You have some manufacturers saying they'll have all electric platforms. You've got Volkswagen, $10 billion plus investment plan over the next 5 years. You've got folks that are releasing new cars left and right. Nissan just announced a new car that by 2019 will have over 200 miles range. You have the Tesla 3 coming out. You have Chevy Bolt. So these cars aren't the Teslas that have to spend $100,000 for them. These are cars that are getting into the $25,000 to $35,000 range. And as you expand the range from 200, from say 100 to 200, and as you increase the charging infrastructure so that people can charge at work and they can charge on the highway, and as you enhance the speed at which you can charge. So for example, Honda is working on something that they think will be out by 21 or 22 where they could do a full charge in 15 minutes. So that's one of the nice things about a gasoline car, I run out of gas, if you win, I'm up at 5 minutes. So those are the critical things. And interestingly, electrification is probably part of the solution. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the rest of the panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Great information. Frank, you're up next. We're going to try to get your slides up, so bear with us. We have about 20 minutes left, so we'd like to maybe leave a little time at the end for some questions and answers, but just give us a second. You want to get started?
Sure. I don't have anything certainly as lengthy or as detailed as Tom's presentation. He's the keynote for this. We're all here to sort of tee up the Q&A and provide some context of what's going on Long Island from our own perspective. I have a few backdrop slides. But what I will say, and I'll mention this, is that my company, Fuel Cell Energy, is relatively new. It's a new face to Long Island. The company itself has been around for about 40 years. We're based in Connecticut, in Danbury. We manufacture our fuel cell technology straight up Route 8 off the Port Chef Ferry to Bridgeport up in Torrington. So in some respects, we are neighbors from a technology standpoint, but the recent awards that we've had of 3 power plants under our LIPA feed-in tariff program kind of put some visibility of us as a company and our technology on Long Island in a way that it hasn't been here before. Let's see if they get this up. What I want to kind of talk about a little bit is who we are as a company, but also the context of why would a fuel cell make sense in the landscape of energy activities on Long Island. How does it perhaps fit into the thinking that went into LIPA's RFP, and also some of the applications of this technology as it fits among solar, wind, and other resources. Okay. Well, you got the opening slides, so we'll go to the next slide.
Next slide.
That second one down. Perfect. As a company, we call ourselves in sort of 3 categories: energy supply, energy recovery, and energy storage. What we're doing on Long Island is really energy supply. We make fuel cell power plants that are either behind the customer, 1 to 5 megawatts in size, hospitals, universities. We have about 50 installations around the world, about 300 megawatts. We also have some that are what we call grid side, 5 to 25 megawatts in size. They're not on a customer's premises, certainly not as large as the Barrett facilities or Cadence facilities, but in a meaningful way, kind of be inserted among the mix of power plants at key locations. We have energy recovery. You may be seeing some things about ExxonMobil with carbon capture. There's some actually commercials on television. That carbon capture technology that they're using is actually our fuel cells used in an application where we're able to separate CO2 from another power plant. Kind of interesting innovation. That's our recovery area. And in energy storage, we have some technologies that can take electricity to hydrogen to a fuel cell, and then back through that same fuel cell, hydrogen to electricity to water vapor. So we see ourselves playing in pure power generation, some innovations in reducing carbon, and also in this growing landscape of people trying to make good storage applications as these grids get changed and are more dynamic. Now, what really this comment is going to, well, why the fuel cell power for Long Island? Why our company might be interested in this? As I said, the face that we're bringing out is a result of being awarded nearly 40 megawatts of power plants. They're moderately sized, 7 megawatts to 18 megawatts. Relative to the 5,000 megawatt peak load or the size of the Barrett, this Port Jeff facilities, they're rather modest. But what makes them interesting and how they fit into the fabric is fuel cells are the most efficient means to convert fuel to electricity. It's an electrochemical, it's a battery technology process. You put fuel in, you get electricity out, there's no combustion. It's highly efficient. As a result, it winds up complying and is part of New York's clean energy standard. It also has some features that, many of you may be aware of the New York REV, or the definition of REV, renewing the energy vision. It's a way for New York to kind of move forward and get more distributed generation, avoid transmission and distribution costs, and to start inserting microgrids and other advanced technologies into the way people consume power that's produced. So this technology we have fills a lot of a void in many respects between traditional resources, the adoption of solar, the adoption of offshore wind, because it's quiet, it's modular, it's adaptable. You can put it behind the meter, behind the customer. It also is very adaptable to underutilized locations. A lot of our power plants are at industrial properties, remediated brownfields, small pockets of properties that otherwise might not be core to what we talked about this morning with smart growth and vision for Long Island. But there's a necessity about the way these power plants have to fit into the fabric of power generation. And we go about our job as technology people in a lot of the ways that the utility planners go about their jobs, kind of quietly behind the scenes, filling those voids so that all the smart growth can happen, all the office parks can get built out, all the housing that was talked about this morning can get built out. But behind the scenes, power plants are being put in place, maybe not as large as they once were, and certainly not as inefficient as they have been, but we still need power. And so what's happening is that the diversity of power resources is changing. And that's the last line. We're sort of a key resource in a diverse, clean, reliable, and resilient grid. One of the things that Tom, I thought he was going to get into in his comments, but kind of lays the groundwork for conversations is, over time, Long Island started out as a place where all the power came from large on-island power plants. That got complemented by other plants like the Caithness facility, and then power began to get more imported from the west and even from Connecticut across Sound. So what's also happened is that we've moved from that standpoint to now wanting on-island solar, offshore wind. And an overlay is that the way in which power is being consumed has changed. You know, there's certainly more power density on the western end of the island, and there's a migration of population to the eastern end of the island. You've gone from a heavy manufacturing-based large load centers, to more diverse office parks, housing, education, technology facilities. So what you have is a need for certain types of power resources, coupled with a total change in the way the landscape of the using of power is changing today and even changing going forward. That creates some real voids in where power is needed. One of the things that our technology provides, and what came out in this Long Island Power RFP, was that there were certain places on Long Island, and our 3 plants are in the Brookhaven area, but there are places where the substations and the infrastructure really needs to have an injection of power to avoid T&D offsets, to avoid reductions in the power availability. And so our technology fits neatly into that fabric of big plants, new innovation offshore, changes in the way the grid is operating. And so we find ourselves very comfortably finding homes for our technology in these 5, 10, 12, 18 megawatt pockets that are going to exist amid all the other long-range plants. So that's kind of why we're here on Long Island. That was what we think got us to be awarded the power plants on in the LIPO RFP. And we kind of look forward to fulfilling that over the next couple of years and kind of quietly doing our job as a clean resource, keeping the lights on. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Rich.
You're up.
Okay. Well, I'll be very brief, which is not usual, but I did want to recognize a couple of LIPA trustees, current and past. And LIPA, just in the room, because I just noticed my good friend Jeff Greenfield came in. He's on the LIPA board. Matt Cordero, of course, is on the LIPA board. He used to be on the other side of the table criticizing me, but always respectfully, and I think he's got an incredible energy mind. And also Neil Lewis is here, who was on the LIPA board. You weren't on the LIPA board when I was there, I don't know.
Nope.
But that's, and I wish you had been.
I was there for Sandy, though.
You were there for Sandy. We blame you. And also, just to recognize Stan Klimberg, who was our general counsel at LIPA, and Tom DeJesu, who, before I got fired a couple of times, I guess, was the executive director of LIPA under the old LIPA. There's a lot of different reincarnations. And I do want to commend Tom Falcone. I've gotten to know him a little bit. I think he's doing a terrific job. Because LIPA is very different today than what it was. And talking about the energy future also looks at the LIPA future. And LIPA has different roles and responsibilities, and I think Tom has handled them very well. And I think, just to make a few points to elaborate on what he said about our energy future. You know, LIPA has really been in the forefront of all of these new technologies long before they were developed as much as they are today. Solar energy, we were the first to adopt a solar pioneer program. Stan, you may remember that. I remember it's an amazing thing at the time. Our big celebration with then Congressman Steve Israel was 1,000 megawatts of rooftop solar. Today it's going well beyond that. And I think some of the projects that LIPA is doing, some of the largest solar projects are going to be terrific. And when you talk about fuel cells, well, LIPA was one of the first utilities in the country to have fuel cells in Babylon from a company that's, I don't think there anymore, Plug Power. A little controversial, but we were the first to do it. And offshore wind, LIPA was the first to propose and almost get an offshore wind project. It was, I think it was 140 megawatts. Then Governor Pataki was a big supporter of it. Governor Spitzer came in. He wasn't such a supporter of it, and it was almost permanent. Neil, I know, fought hard for it, and it was abandoned. But now we're looking at thousands of megawatts offshore wind, which I think is a great thing. Three things. One, I think one of the things that Tom was saying, and people in here may not agree on every little detail, is that your energy future on Long Island, it has to be a mix of all of the things, some traditional, some non-traditional. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. One of the things I found when I came to LIPA, and we actually took over LILCO, and I see Ernie Fazio, who was a big contributor to a lot of the things that we did, and I thank you, Ernie, for that, is that we basically had very little access to power from off of the island. So everything we had to do, we had to build power plants to meet it. And so the thing that I'm most proud of that LIPA did back then was to build the cross-sound and Neptune cables to open up Long Island. We're no longer an isolated island. And we can import power from other parts of the region and the country. And that's still important. Those cables are critically important, along with some of the other cables that pre-existed LIPA, one of them being obviously owned by the New York Power Authority as well. So I think that being able to import power to the island is critical. But in the end, you've got to be able to produce it here. Because things can happen in other parts of the country. Lines can be ripped, as these lines have experienced, like all transmission lines, especially those underwater. So you've got to look at on-island as well. And I think, you're basically looking at three things. You're looking at renewable energy. And I think the solar, some of the largest solar scale projects that LIPA is working on, very important and very helpful. Two, even though it's not physically on Long Island, is offshore wind. And I think offshore wind is a great technology. And it's going to be developed. The price is going to come down. And, the project that we were looking to do back in the early 2000s, not that long ago, has been now made much cheaper and more viable. The turbines are bigger, and the time is right to do it. We do have to keep our eyes on the cost. I think Tom pointed out that the projected costs are going to be much lower than they are today, but you got to get to that point. And we're the people in this room and your constituents, we're the customers are going to have to pay for that. And right now, there's still a premium to pay for offshore wind. And so we've got to be very careful in how we bring in offshore wind and when we do it and stage it so that it's economically viable for the ratepayers. Because as Tom pointed out, while our bills have been relatively stable, and thank you for the compliments, people forget that LILCO bills when we took over were over 20% higher than when we were able to take over, and actually refunded money to every ratepayer on Long Island directly, but those days may be gone. So we have to pay attention to rates. The other thing I think that's critically important, and LIPA is doing too, and I've been involved a little bit in it, is battery storage. Because ultimately building all of these technologies are very good, but some of them don't work all the time. There isn't always sun. There isn't always wind. So you've got to be able to figure out ways to produce the energy renewably and then store it so you can use it at peak times, especially during the summer. And there are areas of Long Island, and you just mentioned it, Frank, it's very astute, was like the East End and the South Fork, where there's tremendous pressure for power and not enough of it. So I think battery storage is going to be critically important, like it is developing several large battery storage projects. Battery storage is new technology. It's becoming bigger. It's critically important to go with renewable energy in the future. So you've got wind, you've got solar, you've got battery storage, you've got fuel cells, a great mix. And then you get to the question of generation. I think there are two issues there, and then I'll finish. One is you need some form of modern baseload generation to integrate offshore wind. You can't just send wind from the windmills onto the island. It's not, unless it's integrated into the grid in an appropriate way and balanced correctly, it's not going to be productive. So you got to then figure out what do you do with the baseload generation that we currently have. You've got, and primarily, I think Tom mentioned it, it was Port Jefferson, Barrett, and Northport. There are other projects, and by the way, we've got a number of peaking plants all across Long Island that we had to build because at the time LIPA took over Luco, the lights almost went out. We didn't have enough power. Now we have a surplus of power, and that's a good thing. But I think you have to look at three things. One, and I agree with Tom, the generation at Northport and Barrett in particular, but Port Jefferson as well, has to be downsized. But it also has to be cleaned up. And I think one of the key issues out there, and I have to give Matt credit because many years ago when I was at LIPA, he did a big study on modernizing and repowering and of those plants. And to be honest with you, we should have listened more to that. I do believe, when you look at the polluters on Long Island, some of the biggest polluters are these plants. The water at Northport and Reynolds Channel and over at Barrett, Port Jefferson, they're filthy, and they need to be cleaned up, whether it's through a smaller baseload plant or through peakers that you're going to put there on the sites. They need to be cleaned up. We should not be living with those aging power plants in the condition they're in. Have you ever been through Northport? I went through all of those plants when I was at LIPA. I went through Barrett, I went through Northport, I went through Port Jefferson. You have to go like this when you're walking through it, as you know. You'd be shocked to see the condition of those plants. They need to be cleaned up, modernized, or replaced with smaller facilities, and that's important. So in the end, you've got a mix. You've got renewables, you've got smaller, cleaner base load generation, and finally energy efficiency, which we didn't talk a lot about today, but I think which is critically important as well. But I think that with LIPA and PSEG and National Grid, and I have to give compliments, Kathy, to National Grid too, they took over Keyspan. LIPA approved that takeover, by the way, when I was there. And I think National Grid has done a very good job in operating those plants under tough circumstances because they are old, they are aging, they are inefficient, and not easy to operate them. So I think, all of these companies working together, I think that we have a very bright energy future. We just have to be prudent as to how we lay it out over what period of time.
Thank you, Richie. Definitely one, maybe two questions. Is there a question in the room? Ernie?
Yeah, Tom, you talked about having smart meters, and in the past, you had smart meters that were designed to give you different rates at different times of the day. Not so much to control what you were doing, but to be able to maximize the cost so that people were encouraged. I could see with the modern equipment being bifurcated and trifurcated rates, and that's going to be more money to the guy who can't discipline the flow. Is that a problem?
Well, I think you're right, Ernie. I mean, when you have more modern rate infrastructure, you can give people more pricing options, and people, just much like they price their cell phone, there's, if you go to a cell phone carrier, you can get 5 different pricing options, and we'll be in a position to offer more things. And so for you'll have a customer, for example, who might buy an electric vehicle, and if they agree to charge the electric vehicle overnight rather than during the peak of the day, they might get a break. Or some folks would be interested in paying a little less for electricity and running the wash later in the day. Other folks, want their convenience to pay what they want.
I don't have the ability to be disciplined over the use. Let's say I am that customer. Do I say, no, I don't want your meter? Or is this something else?
No, I think where we are is we'll offer you pricing options and you get to choose them. Some customers will choose to use energy in ways that cost less. Because energy, while right now we offer pricing that's basically flat, the cost to produce that energy isn't flat. So for example, we have a plant like Port Jefferson runs very few days a year. probably less than 30, but you need it for those 30 days. If you can have people use, maybe they turn up the thermostat a couple of degrees during the 5 peak days of the year, you can give them a price break. We already do some of that right now. So for example, if you go and you buy a new thermostat and you allow us to turn up the thermostat a couple of degrees, we'll help you pay for the thermostat. So I think that those are, technology's changing so much that I think you're going to see folks who use the Alexas of the world to basically control when they run the dishwasher and how they use their thermostat. Maybe they turn the thermostat down a couple of degrees at 11 a.m., but then they turn it up a couple of degrees.
I'm trying to discover if there's going to be resistance.
I'm sure there's going to be some customers that want to take advantage of those and others that don't, much like even right now you have, if you go to some cell phone carriers, you can go to one cell phone guy and we'll give you unlimited data and the price is up here, and somebody else, you have some data limits and it's over here. So I think it's really more about giving customers choices. If they would like to keep their current choice, then they can keep the current choice. If they take a different choice, they make it a price break.
All right, one more question, then lunch is almost ready.
Okay, so electric vehicles was a big part of your ending slide there, if I recall. And I just wonder if you talk with businesses about putting electric vehicle charging stations at their various places of work, one of the questions that comes up is that should they make it free, which then people say, hey, why is it free and someone's paying for it? If you charge a fee, though, this swiping is actually pretty pricey. It seems like one company has kind of locked up the service there. And it's like $500 a year for each of those. And so the business kind of looks at it as an expense to put the unit in, then there's going to be this expense to maintain it, and they have no expectation, no solid sense of how many people use it every day. I was wondering, have you looked at that question of whether there might be ways to deal with some of that cost, and can the business recoup some of that cost by charging a little bit more than what the homeowner would pay at home? I don't know if you've looked into those questions.
So I'd say there's a couple of questions there. On the first one, if you're a business and you put in charging, you can get a tax credit, and then we'll give you a rebate for up to $4,000. So that will pay for a lot of the physical infrastructure, and then people have options on pricing. So a business could choose to charge, could choose to give it away for free. My personal view is that for electric vehicles to really grow, there's a few things that need to happen. Number one, people just have to have, there has to be good choices of cars. I mean, right now, unless you can either pay $100,000 for a car or you can fit in a car the size of a Chevy Bolt, there's really not much for you. And so, but you see electrification of vehicles, and it might not all be a whole total electric vehicle, but plug-in hybrids. So you see that that's the trend, and so that's interesting. Let's say it is a pure electric vehicle where you have some range anxiety. How do you fix that? Well, most likely people are going to charge at home. And so that means that you have to deal with the charge at home problem. And if everybody charges at home in the right way at the right time, frankly, it will reduce electric rates because we won't be building any more plants. You'll just be putting, charging off-peak through the existing infrastructure, more volume, same cost, reduces rates. The problem is that that's a very complicated thing to get people to do that right, because it's not even as easy as a time of use rate, where I say, if you charge at 10 p.m., I'll give you a price break. Because what if you and your neighbor and the third one down the street all want to charge at 10 p.m.? That's the new 10 p.m. peak. So I gave you a break, but now I still need to upgrade the transformer and I still need to upgrade the grid. It just becomes the new peak. To give a sense, an electric vehicle is like adding about 50% to the typical home. So it's like you had a couple thousand square foot home, and then you added another 1,000 square feet. It's pretty significant if you get a lot of people doing it. So you got to deal with managed charging at home. That's where most people are going to charge. When are people not going to charge at home? It's probably they forgot to plug the car in and they have to go to work. And so I don't think people are going to, for the most part, charge at work on a routine basis. I suspect that it's more for the emergency situation or at the hotel, if I'm staying in a hotel, And then there's the third thing, which is distance, which is I need to drive a couple hundred miles in a day. And in that, what you need is good corridor charging. So you need to have charging infrastructure like you see Tesla putting in along major corridors, where if I'm driving from here to Montauk, I need to be able to stop someplace and top it up real quick if I start in the wrong place. You know, there are different levels of charging. So the home charger is probably going to take me 4 hours to fill up my car. The workplace charger is probably about the same. It's not meant for the quick fill up. The charging infrastructure along those major corridors would be much, much more energy intensive and faster charging. But that's how you get to somebody who can top up in 30 minutes, or Honda's talking about topping up in 15 minutes. If I can get to an 80% charge in 15 minutes, I would change how people think about electric cars. So all this stuff's in the future, but I think and we've been talking about electric cars for 20 years, maybe more. But the thing is, number one, you see the auto manufacturers really putting a lot of money in new equipment. And then number two, you see the rapid price in batteries. As battery prices decline, the cost of those cars decline, they become more mainstream. That means that if you're planning out, you know, I don't think it's, we don't have to be ready for this stuff next year, but do we need to be ready 5 years from now, or 7 years from now, or 10 years from now? Yeah, so that's our time frame. We need to work on a whole bunch of things that make it right as the industry moves in that direction.
All right, folks, that concludes today's session. Thank you.